Hi everyone, I'm Ákos and I want to show you how you can install Docker on your Mac. And you may think that you already know the answer because you can use Docker Desktop, but this is not the only way and I want to show you some alternatives. So you have two main options. You can use a desktop application like Docker Desktop or create a virtual machine manually and install everything inside that virtual machine manually, including the operating system and Docker. Even if you use a desktop application, you will have a virtual machine because you need one if you want to run Linux containers on your Mac. Now let's talk about some specific applications. Docker Desktop is probably the easiest way to run Docker on your Mac, but if you want to have some other desktop application, you can use Rancher Desktop. Rancher Desktop and Docker Desktop are very similar, but there are some differences which I will talk about later. Let's say you don't even want to use any desktop application, you just want to create a virtual machine, then you can use UTM or Multipass. Docker Desktop and Rancher Desktop have similar features. They will run a virtual machine and give you a GUI to manage your containers. And because you will have a virtual machine, they need to configure your clients to be able to connect to the remote host from your host operating system. And the good news is that you can use these applications on Linux, macOS, and also on Windows, so you can still use your favorite operating system and run the same desktop application. If you want to use and run a container which was designed to run on an AMD 64 processor, but you have your Mac with the ARM processor, you can use the emulator and emulate the CPU architecture and still run that container. And sometimes you want to forward ports from your host into your container. In case of Docker Desktop and Rancher Desktop, they need to forward that port from your host into your virtual machine, and then Docker can forward that port into your container. Mounting file systems is very similar because then Docker Desktop and Rancher Desktop need to mount that file system from your host into your VM, and then Docker can mount that into your container. And sometimes you may think that you want to get into that virtual machine to look around and see your file system. And the bad news is that there is no easy way to do that. And when I say there is no easy way, I feel I need to explain it more, because you may think that there is an easy way because you can just run a container and share the PID namespace with the host operating system and then use NSEnter to connect to the virtual machine. And yes, this is easy for us, maybe, but this is not easy for everyone. And this is only usable when you have a running Docker daemon. If something goes wrong with your Docker daemon, then you cannot use this solution and you need another, and that other solution is not obvious either. Now let's talk about Docker Desktop. If you want to use Docker Desktop, you can create a development environment, which means you can create a container and clone your repository, for example, from GitHub, and then click on this Open in VS Code button to open this container from your Visual Studio Code. And this is what you can see on the next slide. But this is not the only feature of Docker Desktop. You can use Docker extensions to extend your graphical interface. So this is one extension, the usage extension, and you can use it to see how much space you use inside the virtual machine. You could get that information from the terminal using that Docker system df, but if you prefer to use a graphical interface, then you can also see a diagram here. Now, Rancher Desktop is a little bit different, but of course this was designed to run a single node Kubernetes cluster and not Docker. You can still use Docker, but then you need to enable it. On the other hand, you can choose a specific Kubernetes version, which you could not do with Docker Desktop. And on the next slide, you can see how you can enable Docker. So you need to go to Preferences and then the Container Runtime tab, and then switch from Containerd to Dockerd. If you don't want to use desktop applications, then you can use UTM, which is to emulate operating systems. But if you have your Mac with the ARM processor, then you also have the virtualization framework, so you can create virtual machines as well. Using UTM, you can also use a desktop operating system easily and connect to the graphical interface. UTM uses QEMU to emulate the operating system, and it also gives you a GUI, but not for managing your containers, but for managing your virtual machines, or emulated operating systems. It is only supported on iOS, but because we want to talk about Docker Desktop, then let's just mention macOS. And if you want to download it, you can download it for free from the website. If you want regular updates, then you can download it from the App Store and also pay for it. You can also use Multipass, which is similar to Windows Subsystem for Linux on Windows. And if you know VSL, then you know you can open a shell, which means you will run a virtual machine and run the shell inside that virtual machine. Of course, in that case, you cannot choose which image you want to use, so you can go to your terminal and run multipass find to find an image. You can choose an LTS version of Ubuntu, or you can choose another application based on those LTS versions. For example, you can choose the image called Docker and have your Docker installed inside that virtual machine, and also have Portainer, which is a web-based interface for your containers. If you want to test Kubernetes clusters, then you can use Minikube. Multipass runs virtual Ubuntu servers without desktop by default, but of course, if you want to have graphical interface, you can install it later, and in that case, you need to install some remote desktop application too, so you can connect to that graphical interface. Multipass also supported on Linux, macOS, and Windows, and you will get the emulation feature, and also you will get Portainer inside that virtual machine. It will be pre-installed but not be configured, because you need to open it first from your web browser and configure it. And sometimes when you wait too long, you need to restart the container for security reasons, so you can make sure that will not be configured by someone else. There are some limitations, so you can use just a few parameters, but this is enough if you just want to run a virtual machine quickly. You can set the number of CPUs and the amount of memory, and you can also use Cloudinit to manage your boot process. If you want to use the image called Docker, then you will have some requirements, and you cannot run that virtual machine using only one processor and, for example, 1 GB of memory. Even if you know that the Hello World application that you want to test would run on that virtual machine. And there is no desktop by default in that virtual machine. It can be a limitation, or maybe you don't even care about that. And now the question is, which one is the winner? And you can guess what I'm going to say. There is no real winner here. If you want to say that someone or something is the winner, then I think you are the winner, because you can choose the best application for you and be happy. If you want me to be happy, please click on the subscribe button below the video, or like my video so I know that you need more videos like this. If you have any question or recommendation, please let me know in the comment section. See you next time.